Welcome to the Two Gurus Top Compliance podcast with me, Kristy Grant-Hart. I'm here with the one and only Tom Fox. This week, we're covering the Best of Compliance Week National Conference, the UK's expansion of whistleblower programs and self-reporting goodies, crystal ball analysis about what happens if the US stops caring about money laundering, and Florida man's drug-related last name. But first, Tom, how's your week been, and what do you think has been the most interesting development?
I would say one development was both my favorite and the biggest, and that was being with you and all of our friends and colleagues at Compliance Week 2025. Multiple people said, what was your favorite session? And my favorite session was seeing everybody. I could not, I even surprised myself. And what I had not really thought about was there are people I've known since 2017, 2018, certainly pre-pandemic, I've never met.
Huh.
And Vera Sharapanova was the biggest one because I walked past her and she goes, Tom. And I looked over and I went, Vera, just like we're old friends. And we literally had never met. And that was the truth with a lot of people. And that was exciting. Obviously seeing you, the Sparky team, everybody. We're going to talk about that a little bit more and some of the awards and honors your teammates got, talking about that. Of course, we both enjoyed multiple panels and the entire vibe, but it was just being around people I've known for nearly 10 years. And we're all a little bit older, maybe a little bit grayer, but we're still hanging out and we're still evangelizing compliance in our own way.
I loved it. I thought the energy was fantastic. Tom, cheers to you for coming in last second on our panel. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, I was doing the last session of the entire thing, which some people came to, which I figured there would be like 4 people left, but it was a pretty packed room on the future of compliance. And I knew that nobody else could do it justice like you. So I really enjoyed the panel that we did looking at the possibilities, the probabilities, the frightening possibilities, the great possibilities of the future of compliance. And I have to say that my favorite moment of the entire thing, barring the awards presentation, which we'll get to in a minute, was Ken Polite. I just thought he was so powerful in his delivery. Several people around me said they wanted to shout amen and hallelujah and yes, like big yes, because I just thought his energy was so right on. And we needed that kind of powerful moment of positivity. And I did a little video that he shared, by the way. I felt like a freaking rock star about how he said that uncertainty isn't punishment, it's preparation. And I just thought, what a fantastic message for this moment or for when we're feeling insecure. And I just came out of that feeling jazzed and alive. And then I said to my family that he'd shared my video. And I said, in my world, it's a little bit like Taylor Swift shared me. So I was very excited about that. And just being together. What was the highlights for you, Tom?
Obviously being together, I have to shout out to the Mayflower because Compliance Week was at the Mayflower for 15, 16, 17 years. Then we moved to some other venues, and I just love the Mayflower. I consider her the grand old dame of Washington, D.C. hotels, perhaps other than the J. Adams Hotel is one of my favorites. So that was great to be back there. The staff was just incredibly positive, friendly. Can I help you? Everyone on the staff. That was very cool. I like that sort of long haul setup for vendors. I got to see some old vendor friends types. And some new ones that literally I had never met. I'd never met Roxanne Petraeus from Athena before, and I've done stuff with her for 5 years. So all of that was very cool. The whistleblowers, we had Monday, we had a woman who was involved in setting up the DOJ program, Jane Williams, but I may have her last name wrong. And then Jane Nordberg, who had been at the SEC Office of the Whistleblower. And they talked about sort of the government angle. And we had another panel led by Mary Inman, well-known whistleblower attorney who works at Whistleblower LLP, who represents whistleblowers. So we got to hear about her and the work her firm is doing, and they're really moving to the state level. So I think she had a great phrase that I cited in our panel, which was nature abhors a vacuum. And if there's not going to be enforcement of current existing laws at the federal level, states will step in, individuals will step in under the False Claims Act. We may have international enforcement will increase. And so that was I thought, a pretty powerful message. I enjoyed the mix, as always, of sort of technical presentations, third parties, etc., with Kenneth Polite's sermons. As the compliance evangelist, I certainly appreciate a good sermon. But it was just, Kristy was the people. It was so much fun. We spent 15 minutes sharing a breakfast the last morning, and I had more fun just talking to you over a cup of coffee. And it was the same with everyone I had that opportunity with. Susan Divers and I had lunch together on the last day, and we talked about our children. She's got two sons in their 50s, and I have a daughter in her 20s. And we talked about that and, the arc of her career of AECOM to LRN, and now she's a consultant with Athena. And, what she's been doing this 25 years. So we talked about that and just those sorts of connections. Then I have talked with, but I got to meet the new owner of Compliance Week and the new editor-in-chief Tuesday night. I came home from a late dinner and I said, let me just see who's in the bar. Who was in the bar but the journalists? I got to talk to the EIC and then the Aaron Nicodemus and a new reporter or a journalist with Compliance Week I had not met. So we sat and talked about Compliance Week and the writing they do and things that I would hope that they could take a look at. So all of that was just great fun.
Yeah. We're going to talk about some of the main stories about some of the things that came out of it regarding AI and the UK whistleblowers. So we'll talk about some more of the substantive pieces later on today. But one of the highlights certainly was the awards presentation. And I was delighted, but not surprised, I suppose, to see that my fellow Sparky, Ellen Hunt, won the Lifetime Achievement Award. What a big moment. We were so delighted for her. And I got to tell you, Tom, I posted about it on LinkedIn, and the flood of comments were tremendous in support of the choice of her career, her contribution, how many people that she has helped and mentored over the years. And somebody said, and I thought this encapsulated it well, that who else would it have possibly been? And I thought that was a really lovely way of describing Ellen's win. So congratulations, fellow Sparky Ellen Hunt. It's well-deserved, as was the other award, several awards, but one that you wanted to highlight, Tom.
Well, before we get to the one I want to highlight, my response was she was the obvious choice. So the same theme. And absolutely, she has been such a wonderful, beautiful, and integral part of this community in all of her roles, and just as lovely a human being as you could ever ask to be around. So I was absolutely thrilled. But once again, just got the obvious choice to me. But we had the Mentor of the Year award, and this is one of my favorite people because she and her colleague, Mary Shirley, literally changed the world. And they changed it through mentorship. And the night after she got the award, I was at a dinner where she was there, and I asked the host if I could lead the toast for Lisa Fine, Mentor of the Year. And he said, sure. And I gave a 10-minute toast about how she changed the world. And here is how she and Mary Shirley changed the world. They came to me once and said, you don't have enough diversity in your compliance network. I said, you're right. When are you starting your podcast? And they did. They started Great Women in Compliance, but it didn't stop with that. They started a LinkedIn community, which became an entire community of great women in compliance. And I know you're part of that. You've been on the podcast multiple times. And in 2018, amazingly enough, there was no place for that. And there was no community around that. They started it. And then they wrote a book, Sending the Elevator Back Down, and talked about mentorship. And they both, now Mary has gone on to other things, and Hema Lomax has stepped in as the primary co-host with Lisa, but Lisa is still there. And Lisa is driving mentorship. Started off for great women, but it's literally for everyone. And for her to be honored in that way, to me, was incredibly touching, incredibly important. And she literally changed the world. She created an entire space, entire community of engagement of great women in compliance. And so I was thrilled when she got that award. And with the same I felt with Ellen, I just thought she was the obvious choice. She's not Mentor of the Year. She's just the mentor, along with Mary in my eyes, because of what they did with great women in compliance.
Excellent. That was beautiful. And the Program of the Year award, I found it very touching going to the Red Cross Ukraine. My God, what a hard job. And I think that it's beautiful that was the award. So we can move from all our joy and happiness, Tom, to start talking about what's going on in the world and our stories. Where do you want to start?
I want to start with Elizabeth Warren. And Elizabeth Warren gave a speech on the floor of Congress on to commemorate 100 days of Donald Trump by reading aloud 100 reports of his corruption. And it was things like calling out Tesla for people to buy cars from the White House, paying for the Easter egg roll with corporate sponsors, with businesses before the government, pushing out former U.S. officials who called out his lies about the 2020 election, helping his son set up a club where people can pay $500,000 for access to Trump's cabinets, hosting multi-million-dollar dinners for companies in front of their regulator, the HHS. This one is just beyond belief. Launching a crypto meme coin before his inauguration, and now has taken a $2 billion investment from the UAE on it. So without a doubt, the most corrupt president ever. And kudos to Elizabeth Warren for calling him out on it.
I'm not sure it's going to change anyone's mind on either side, but putting it in the congressional record, this thing will last forever. So there we go. All right, let's talk about one of the things that I found really interesting and hadn't been tracking as much as I probably should from Compliance Week. It's from a source we've never seen before, Tom. I don't think we've ever quoted the Scottish Financial News, but today's the day. So this article is titled SFO Plans to Explore Whistleblower Rewards in Fraud Crackdown. Now, in keeping with our theme, Jane Norberg of Compliance Week at Compliance Week talked about this as her most interesting and watched development for the next year. Right now, whistleblowers in the UK are protected under the Public Interest Disclosure Act, but critics argue the protections are too limited and don't do enough to encourage speaking up. So while we in the United States are very familiar with whistleblower awards by the government, some folks in the UK are not, but it's going in that direction. So businesses should be paying attention regardless, because the new failure to prevent fraud offense, which has been coming into force, is coming into force this year officially. So what's happened is that the SFO is looking at adding these whistleblower payments, which I know you're going to talk about a little bit later, but also the UK's IRS, or Internal Revenue Service, which is called HMRC, is already giving out whistleblower payments. So I think this is really interesting, Tom. This has really been more of a U.S. phenomenon, the idea of the Dodd-Frank payments or of key TAM suits where you can get a percentage of the recovery. But it looks like it's going to become potentially a trend in the UK. So the big question is, do you think that it will be a trend? And do you think it will continue to go into maybe Europe or Asia? What are you thinking about this?
And certainly, this is something Mary Inman talked quite a bit about on her panel. And there was a lot of work that she did to lay the groundwork for this, she and others, when she lived in London. But the head of the SFO is very interested in this program. He sees this as a big boon to the SFO's work. Interestingly, it's the tax division or tax department or His Majesty's Tax Service that's really leading this, because they've shown it works in the United Kingdom. And I think it will certainly grow in the UK. The continent is a little bit different because of the historical baggage from literally the Nazis. And I still think there's some discomfort and unease around this topic. It's changing a little bit. But for those countries that either had direct or indirect Nazi rule, it's still a very dicey topic. Obviously, it did not happen in the United Kingdom, so they're more open to it. But I think the UK is going to show this can be a huge benefit and boon to law enforcement. So hopefully other countries will take up this mantle as well.
Fantastic. Okay.
The House of Representatives just wants to destroy everything in America. And their latest attempted destruction is taking away the federal antitrust work from the FTC. Now, the FTC's only had that work for 100 years, or the entire life of the FTC, but they seem to think the Department of Justice is more suited for doing antitrust work. Now, I'm sure the former tenure of Lena Khan had nothing to do with that. I'm sure this is a very academically based, non prejudicial move by the House Republicans. Nevertheless, there is a difference because the DOJ prosecutes criminal violations of antitrust law, and the FTC prosecutes civil. And so there's always been a qualitative difference in the two. And if you're going to take away the enforcement component of the FTC, probably the next step is to take away the regulatory aspect. You're going to move regulation over to the DOJ. And I can't remember in your professional legal career if you had to go through an M&A project, but it is a incredibly intensive, time-intensive, paper-intensive, document-intensive process that can take years. But if it doesn't take years, it's going to be 20 hours a day for a lot of days. So you want to have regulators and people with regulatory experience looking at that. And all of this is overlaid by the DOJ still going after big tech, full force, Google and Apple. You kind of wonder what's the DOJ really going to do or who are they really after? But I see this as a first move to strip the FTC of civil regulatory and not enforcement, but just regulation and oversight. And it's just another idiotic move by this Congress.
All right. First of all, yes, we were acquired 2.5 months ago. And even though we were a very small company, the amount of time, energy, money, that was an enormous amount of work. So if you multiply that until you got billion-dollar companies, multi-billion-dollar companies trying to merge or acquire each other, that pain seems unbelievable to me. But yeah, okay. Let's ignore the power grab for a minute, which obviously is a big thing to ignore. Can the consolidation work, right? They're having multiple agencies doing antitrust. What if we did just have one and we were to scale up the DOJ? They do have an antitrust division already. On paper, it sounds like it would be a reasonable thing to do, to say, you know what? The FTC can still do its regulation, but the DOJ is going to be the prosecutor. What about that is totally untenable if you ignore the political overlay?
I just think it's untenable because you don't have the regulatory expertise inside the Department of Justice. You have the criminal prosecution expertise. You have the ability to look at this under criminal law. You have the ability to look at precedent, et cetera. Everything a lawyer does, a prosecutor does. And that is not completely antithetical, but it's a different skill set than the regulators. And probably 99.98% of all mergers are either approved or not approved at the FTC level. And the number that require criminal prosecutions is minuscule. And you're absolutely right about just the detail you had to go through. And now imagine that for multi-billion-dollar corporations. And you're going to send this to an aid department that's been starved of money, funding, and lawyers already. You're never going to get a ruling. And that's the whole point of what the House is trying to do.
Let's stick with our theme. Our first theme was Compliance Week. Our second theme is non-enforcement and power changes. So let's go to America's likely withdrawal from the fight against money laundering. So this article comes from Corporate Compliance Insights, and it's called Power Shift: What Happens When America Steps Back from Global AML Enforcement. So the article is a fascinating crystal ball exercise on the various courses anti-money laundering or AML enforcement could take in the new political reality. So the author suggests two likely but competing pathways. The first would be that the Trump administration stops all AML enforcement altogether, or just about. And the second being that the Trump administration stops enforcement against U.S. companies while leveling up enforcement against foreign companies. So in the second scenario, the author envisions the possibility of Europe and or the UK ramping up enforcement against American companies in a tit-for-tat exercise. It also posits that bad actors might channel illicit funds specifically through the US if there is a lower level of enforcement. And it ends by talking about how money laundering is an increasingly global activity. So like our supply chains, it doesn't stay in one country, and ideally enforcement would be a multi-jurisdictional feature of cooperation, but we'll see how likely that is. So, Tom, we haven't had a lot of information yet about how AML enforcement might change. What does your crystal ball say? Is this a path one? Is it a path two? Is it going to be non-existent? Does the nature abhors a vacuum mean that the EU and UK come in? What's your take?
That's a lot of questions.
You have a lot of answers, though, Tom. I know you.
First of all, there will be no doubt there'll be a rollback of U.S. enforcement of AML because the Trump administration does not understand or even want to look at the national security issues involved. All they care about is being able to do transactions. And whether they do transactions by paying bribes, whether they do transactions by money laundering, they view that as the interest of the United States. Nature does abhor a vacuum and there will be greater enforcement by others. But here's the thing I heard at Compliance Week that really I had not thought about. What happens if, due to non-enforcement, the United States moves to a gray list or a sanctioned country list? Is it going to be based on any sort of TI, CPI? Obviously, that's going to go down. And FACTA, whatever the financial trade organization in Europe is certainly going to sanction or at least write up the United States if they make the conscious decision to cut back. The suspension of the Corporate Transparency Act is certainly a step in that direction, certainly a step in the wrong direction. These are laws on the books. These are not made up laws or regulatory interpretation or tree-hugging liberals trying to stop business. These are just the Trump administration saying, oh, we're not going to enforce laws on the books. And if the United States moves to a level as a country that either requires additional due diligence, requires scrutiny, requires waivers, U.S. companies are going to suffer. And the Trump administration does not seem to understand that at all.
Yeah. In our future session, I think I shocked people by saying it's not impossible that the U.S. could be a sanctioned country if we invade Greenland. These things could be coming. I really hope not. Okay, let's go back and stick with the UK. What's happening with their corporate cooperation and enforcement information?
Well, on late April, the SFO issued guidance called External Guidance on Corporate Cooperation and Enforcement Leading to Corporate Criminal Offending. Only the Brits would have a title such as that. God bless them. I will give you a history lesson on why that is on another episode, but I had to learn that once. But it really is a very helpful roadmap on the decision to self-report, how to self-report, the cooperation that the SFO expects. Obviously, these are all around the UK Bribery Act, or at least laws in the United Kingdom. But it's great to have any sort of guidance. And even if we don't have this specific type of guidance in the United States, or the specific guidance we have is withdrawn by the Trump administration, it provides a framework to think through this. We've had lots of lawyers who've done lots of work over the years who have that institutional knowledge, and unfortunately, companies do as well. But I think anytime you can get guidance from one of the top regulators or enforcers in international ABC laws, it's a good thing, whether it's Brazil, whether it's France, whether it's the United Kingdom or the United States. So once again, the SFO is leading the way and leading the discussion around anti-corruption and anti-bribery, and I welcome this. And it's a very short read, so if you're interested, just click through the link on the show notes and download it so you have it on your computer.
So I was really impressed with just how plain English this was. Reading it, it was very clear. I could hand this to my very smart 8th grade niece and say, what do you think of this? And she'd actually probably be able to tell me how it works. But Tom, do you see any differences or major differences in the approach the SFO is taking versus the guidance the DOJ has put out over time?
So I really didn't see major differences, except that this is, as probably you would agree, coming from the United Kingdom, more thoughtful than some of the specific guidance we get. And that, I would say, is a characteristic of a difference in kind of the way the legal system works in the United Kingdom and the United States. But I didn't see anything sort of major, but just sort of details that you would probably know but have never seen in print before.
Okay. All right, so we're going to go back to our theme of Compliance Week. And I would say that if there had been a drinking game at Compliance Week where people took a shot of whiskey every time people used the words AI, that they would all be hospitalized because it was absolutely constant. We all know AI is the rage and that it has a strong effect on the workplace. But the article I chose that's kind of related to this is AI is enabling an always on economy and companies need to pick up the pace. So, the main point of this article is that humans need to pick up their pace in decision making and that meetings and to make decisions may be becoming obsolete because any delay is a bad thing. So, the article highlights an executive who used to work only till 11 o'clock, good grief, and that he would have to wait overnight to task an associate with analyzing more information. But now, as he goes to bed, he can tell the AI to review websites, analyze information, come up with a point of view so that he can take action as soon as he wakes up. The article talks about how customers expect immediate answers and doing crazy things like getting together to talk about options isn't productive anymore because Slack is the place to make big choices after AI tells you what to do. I think we saw this in the Sam Bankman-Fried or one of the other crypto problems where they were making decisions by thumbs up emojis for millions of dollars of problematic payments. So, look, Tom, any article that starts out with the always on economy and we need to be doing more and picking up the pace makes me a little bit nuts. But what do you think? I thought this was an interesting idea. Should we be taking all of our meetings off our calendars in this always on world to make decisions without each other?
So it's been some time since you've been in the corporate world, as for me, and the biggest bane of my corporate existence was meetings. Hated meetings because 95% of them were poorly run or not run at all and not needed. And even Jamie Dimon, head of JP Morgan, in his sort of annual tome, 57-page letter, specifically called out meetings. And he said, if you have to have a meeting, put rigor around it, have an agenda, have a firm fixed starting point, have a firm fixed ending time. Could this meeting have been dealt with via email? Could it have been dealt with two people? And so while I hadn't really thought through use of AI to fight the bane of meetings, it's just one more tool, and meetings are the worst. And I remember in early COVID where I'd slot in to talk to a client or a customer, and they'd been, it was their eighth meeting and it was noon. And sometimes you have to go to the bathroom. Sometimes you need a cup of coffee. Sometimes you want to have lunch. And they were just back to back to back. And now these meetings were all Zoom calls. And so it was a little bit new experience for all of us. But for those people who had standing desks, it was miserable after about 4 hours. I'm in favor of anything that can help cut down on meetings. But the point I took away from this article, Kristy, was yes, employees, the human in the loop has to up their game because AI can be an incredibly efficient tool. And if it's an efficient tool, you need to be either, well, you need to increase your efficiency, but whether that efficiency is on a specific task or how are you going to utilize the time you save by using AI to more efficiently do other tasks or different tasks, I think that's something we all need to think about internally. And so I really focus on that part of it. The more nefarious way is you tell the AI, I'll send this to the associate and tell them I'll expect a response when I get up at 5 a.m. So if you have a chat bot pinging an associate saying, please handle, that's the other thing I thought of. But I think he's absolutely right, or the author's absolutely right. We all need to think through how can we use this, but more equally importantly, how can we increase our personal efficiency, not just putting information into an AI and getting an answer more quickly.
We have some real life fraud that doesn't involve AI. What happened with this guy, Tom?
If I called you up and say, Kristy, I'm going to tell you the storyline of my latest book, you would have just shook your head and said, Tom, no one would believe that. That's why truth is stranger than fiction, because we have a man who posed as a bank chief compliance officer pleading guilty to fraud. He posed as the chief compliance officer of a non-existent bank called Dominion Bank and Trust, and he helped rip off would-be customers as a part of a $4 million scheme. And he is now a disbarred lawyer, and he's been sentenced to prison. But it was the first example I had ever seen of someone claiming to be a chief compliance officer convicted of fraud. We've had regulated industry prosecutions of CCOs who were involved in a fraud or were grossly negligent and essentially buried their head in the sand. And those were typically civil enforcement actions with a fine or penalty and perhaps a suspension. But this one was criminal conviction for being not only involved in the fraud, but fraudulently claiming you were a chief compliance officer. And I've talked myself into that. One of my next books is going to be about
It's a pretty clever one, though. They pretended to tell small businesses they could get credit facilities and they just had to pay an upfront fee and then never got those facilities. I was, wow, that's clever, especially if the chief compliance officer is telling you that it's great. It could only happen in a place similar to Florida, let's be honest. So I think that's a pretty good, it's like a high variation on the Florida theme, which is where we should go now. Should we finish up with Florida, Tom?
Florida man makes his weekly appearance.
It's true. So a Florida man whose first name is Edward was arrested after flipping out over a poorly made Subway sandwich. So Edward accused the workers of having bad attitudes, then jumped over the counter and held one by knife point before his buddy calmed him down and they both left the restaurant. Now, why is this story worthy of being featured on the Two Gurus podcast? Our Florida man's last name is Cocaine. That's correct. He is literally Mr. Edward Cocaine. So the Brevard County Sheriff was doing his best impression of us here at Two Gurus when he wrote on the county's Facebook page, "In New York, you get arrested for defending people on the subway. But in Brevard County, you get locked up behind bars for attacking people in a subway." A subway, mass transit, restaurant. Excellent, sir. This isn't Mr. Cocaine's first trip with law enforcement. In 2014, he was nearly laughed out of the courtroom after a flabbergasted judge sat stunned by Mr. Cocaine's name. The judge asked, "Sir, how many times have the police told you to step out of the car?" To which Mr. Cocaine responded, "Just about every time I get pulled over." Tom, the moral of this story is that cocaine and sandwiches don't go well together in the great state of Florida.
Could I maybe pair that with my last story and say that the character who is the fraudulent chief compliance officer in my next novel will be named Mr. Cocaine?
Oh, man. I love that. Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us at Two Gurus at Top Compliance. I'm Kristy Grant-Hart.
And I'm Tom Fox.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.